In this video, we're going to look at the important features of the Layers panel and go over some of the important layer types that we'll use over the rest of the course. To add a new layer, you would click this Add Layer button to get a drop-down where you can select the type of layer you want to add. Now these first two, vector and image, are the main types of layers that you would create actual artwork on. Let's start with a vector layer. On vector layers, you use the vector drawing tools to create lines and shapes that are defined by precise points and curves. Vector artwork has a lot of upsides. You can modify the points and curves as much as you want, and even animate changes in shapes without degrading the quality of the edge. And it's also resolution independent, meaning it can be scaled up and down or zoomed in and out without ever getting blurry or pixelated. Vector art also takes up less memory and makes file sizes smaller. We're mainly going to be building our characters out of vector art. Next, let's try adding an image layer. That gives us this window. So first of all, if you already have an image that you want to import and use in your project, you could click Browse File and find it, and that would make this new layer that image. But in this case, let's create a blank layer that we can draw on here in Moho. Unlike a vector layer, an image layer is resolution dependent because the content on the image is made up of pixels. So we need to specify the resolution we want this layer to be to make sure we have enough pixels to make a clear image. You'll want your image layers to be at least as big as the output resolution of your animation. But if you're going to need to scale up or zoom the camera in on your artwork, you'll want to be even higher in resolution so it doesn't look pixelated. You can also specify width and height by hand over here. And you'll typically want the background to be transparent unless this is going to be the base background layer or something. And finally, to stay organized, remember you can give your layer a name up here. Then click Create. Then you can use the brush tool and the various brush types here in the toolbar to paint on the image layer. We'll come back to image layers when we talk about doing hand-drawn animation later. You can also import a sequence of images. So suppose you already had a series of frames of animation prepared that you want to use in your project. You would go to Add Layer and Add Image Sequence. Then browse and find your images. Select them all and click Open. Then it will add them all as a single layer. And down on the timeline, these triangles indicate where the sequence starts and stops. You can switch to the Sequencer tab to get a better view if you need to move it around. I'm just going to move this layer and zoom in so we can see it better. By default, each image will be displayed for one frame. If you want to change that, you can double-click on the layer and go to the Image tab where we have a bunch of options. Movie FPS lets us change the frame rate of the image sequence. It defaults to 24, the same as our project, but let's change it to 12 and hit Apply. Now you can see the image sequence lasts twice as long because each image is being displayed for 2 frames. Now currently when the image sequence finishes, the layer just ends, but if you wanted it to hold on the last frame, you could check Persist Last Frame and then hit Apply. Then when we go past the end of our image sequence, that last frame is still displayed. But in the case of this fire animation, a better idea is probably to click Loop Movie indefinitely. Then the image sequence will continue to cycle for the whole length of the timeline. Now this sequence looks weird during playback because it's not rendering any of the pixels that have transparency. It will look normal when it gets exported though. The next option under our Add Layer dropdown is Group. A group is just a folder that you can drag other layers into. This lets you keep your layers organized, and you can collapse a group so the layers don't take up so much space. You can also use all the layer transformations and animation tools on a group, and it will change everything nested inside it at the same time. Also, as a quick tip, if you already have layers you know you want to put in a group, you can select them all and add a group using Group With Selection, and those layers will automatically get put in the new group. Now, the next series of options on the layer dropdown are basically types of groups that have special functionality. For example, if you add a bone layer, this is for creating a character that's rigged with bones. You would typically have all the artwork for your character nested inside it, and then on the top level bone group, this is where you would add the bones you're going to use to rig and animate the character. You then need to do a little bit of work to make sure the right bone is affecting the right part of the artwork, but then you're able to use the bones to control the motion of the artwork inside the bone group. We'll look at bones a lot in later lessons. Next, a switch is a special group for cases where you have a set of images and you want to only show one of them at a time. You can switch between them over the course of your animation by either right-clicking on the group and selecting a layer, or using the Switch Selection panel under the Window menu. You'll see how we use switches as part of our character rigs later. Then the next option on our new layer dropdown is frame by frame. This is how you would set up the ability to do hand-drawn frame-by-frame animation. When you try to add a frame-by-frame group, it's going to ask if you want to use vector layers or image layers to draw the frames of your animation. Let's just do vector layers for now. Now we have what's basically a group with our first frame in it ready to go. A frame-by-frame group works basically just like a switch, except it gives us the added functionality down here on the timeline to add, delete, and duplicate new frames. This lets us easily create new drawings as we move along the timeline to create the timing we want for our drawings. We'll have a whole lesson on doing frame-by-frame animation later. The next set of layer types have more specialized purposes. For example, particle is a cool, easy way to make a particle effect. It makes a group, and then we need at least one layer inside it, and we'll just make a simple circle on it, and this circle will be our particle. Then on the settings for the particle group, there's a tab for particle. And based on these settings, the particle layer automatically spawns and animates copies of the layer inside the group. If you put multiple layers in the folder, it spawns copies of all the layers in it as particles in turn. This is a very versatile feature. Depending what you use for the particle and the settings, you can use this to make all kinds of things, like smoke, or snow, or speed lines. Then the next type of layer you can add is a note. This is just a piece of text you can place in the scene to leave instructions for team members or reminders for yourself. The nice feature of notes is that they show up in the stage but won't be visible when you render, so you won't have to worry about hiding them when you're ready to export. Next, you can also add an audio track. You just need to browse for an audio file. Then you'll see the waveform show up on the timeline. And on the Sequencer tab, you can control its position in time. Then, a patch is a special type of layer we'll use when rigging. In cases where you have parts of the body made up of two layers, you can select one of the layers and add a patch, and target it at the other part. Then, if you position the patch, it will automatically disguise the stroke so that the layers look like they're connected. If you hide the original layers, you can see the actual patch itself that it's generating on the fly. So that's a very handy feature. Next is a text layer. When you create a new text layer, it automatically brings up the layer settings and the text tab, which is where you'll actually enter the text and do all the formatting. You can even add a word balloon to your text down here. And once you have the text layer created, you would position it with the Transform Layer tool. The last type of layer you can add is a 3D object. If you add this, it's going to ask you to browse for a 3D file. specifically an OBJ file. Then click Open. And now that 3D model appears in the scene. This is where being able to have multiple views is helpful. In this view, we can use this tool to rotate our view and get a better view of the model, and use the Layer Transform tools to position and scale and rotate the model to make it look how we want over here in the camera view. So that's the final layer type. Now that we know all the different types of layers that might go in the layer panel, we need to go over some important features of the layers panel itself and the key ways you'll work with layers. We'll cover that in the next videos. I'll see you there.